RAS signaling pathways. RAS pathways are medically important signaling pathways. In a large majority of cancers, these pathways are hyperactivated. Signaling through a hyperactive pathway is much higher than normal. Signaling molecule activates a normal cell or a cancer cell. In the case of the normal cell, you have normal activation of the pathway. In the case of the cancer cell, you have a higher level of response by the pathway than normally. So in the case of the cancer cell, even though the signaling molecule concentrations are the same, the signaling molecule is acting on the cells, the response at the end is much larger than it normally would be. Activation of RAS pathways leads to many responses by cells. Some important examples are cell growth and proliferation, cell division, inhibition of apoptosis, survival, rearrangement of cell cytoskeleton. RAS is a monomeric GTPase. It is active when it has GTP bound. It is inactive when it has GDP bound. Signaling molecule activates RTK, receptor tyrosine kinase, which then goes on to activate GRB2, which then goes on to activate SOS, a RAS-specific GEF. SOS activates RAS. In this picture here, we have all the components leading up to RAS activation in their inactive state. The first step is the signaling molecule binding to the receptor tyrosine kinase and activating it through dimerization and the phosphorylation of the receptor tails, the intracellular tails. This leads to a docking site for GRB2. GRB2 will bind to the phosphorylated tyrosine of the receptor tails through its SH2 domain. SOS will then bind to GRB2. Just notice that SOS is a cytosolic protein that will get localized to the cell membrane the same way GRB2, a cytosolic protein, was localized to the cell membrane. This leads to the activation of SOS. SOS is simply activated the same as GRB2 because of its localization to its target, which is RAS. GRB2 is binding to SOS through its SH3 domains. SH3 domains bind to proline-rich regions. SOS is a RAS-specific GEF. RAS will then bind to SOS. It will then exchange its GDP for GTP, and it will become activated, and it will be no longer bound to SOS. It should be noted that an activated SOS, localized to the cell membrane, can activate many RAS proteins. RAS will go on to activate downstream proteins in different pathways. In this picture, we can see three pathways that are activated by RAS, or RAS-dependent pathways. We have the MAP kinase pathway and the PI3 kinase pathway, two pathways that we'll be discussing in more detail in this class.